I challenge you to take us on a virtual tour from here in New York, but we're imagining we're in the Patek Philippe Museum. We walk through the opening gate. We go up those little stairs. We say hello to the receptionist, and then we find you, Dr. Fries, welcoming us. What's the first thing we do when we walk through the museum? Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Today, I have a guest that I've dreamed to have with us. And today, I welcome Peter Fries, director of the Patek Philippe Museum in Geneva. And he has been very busy in recent years building the Patek Philippe Museum's collection and raising awareness of what is Patek Philippe globally. It is regarded as one of the greatest horological museums ever assembled. And today, in this interview, we were going to dig deep and ask all of the questions we're curious about the Patek Philippe Museum and the man himself, Dr. Peter Fries. I'm especially interested in asking a line of questions of what it's like to be the curator of the Patek Philippe Museum, and especially as the museum continues to evolve as a center of horological learning in the world today. This interview is going to be divided in two parts. The first is about you, and I'm very interested to hear and excited to hear of a tour that you'll be offering to our listeners of the Patek Philippe Museum, essentially a virtual visit of the museum with Peter Fries. The second part will be a further exploration of all things horological and a deep dive into the secrets of the Patek Philippe Museum. But before we begin, here is Peter's official biography. Dr. Peter Fries, curator and director of the Patek Philippe Museum in Geneva, comes from a family of watchmakers in Munich. So it is only natural for him to become a watchmaker and restorer of historical timepieces himself. His path from the workbench to the display cases led him to the study of art history, philosophy, and church history, which he completed in Munich with a doctorate. He then began his museum career, first at the Bavarian National Museum in Munich, followed by stops in Bonn at a branch of the Deutsche Museum, Malibu at the John P. Getty Museum, San Francisco at the Tech Museum in Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Institution. Under the motto, High Tech and History, curator Peter Fries combines the inventor's vision of the future with the art historian's retrospective. Innovative museum concepts are becoming his trademark. In 2011, he returned to Europe, to Geneva, where the Swiss watchmaking heart beats loudest. Watches, clocks throughout the centuries sometimes are also status symbols, and this is Peter's never-ending passion. With all that said, welcome, Peter.
Hi, John. I'm so thrilled to be here in New York and talking about Patek Philippe, 8,000 miles away. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
We are so thrilled to have you here in New York City. And I have this whole pile of questions to ask you, but we're going to get this in two parts.
Okay.
And we're going to start with part one. I want to learn more about you, and then we're going to dive deep into the museum. And then part two, we're going to discuss more horological concepts. So first, my opening question, you've been working at the Patek Philippe Museum for almost 12 years now. What is the best part about being the curator of the Patek Philippe Museum?
Working in museums is so much fun because you decide mostly yourself how you would like to establish this place. And it's a big sandbox, so we all remain to be children and play in the sandbox, and something works and something doesn't, so you can really find out your way. And the people before did it differently, and the people will come later will do it differently, and that's the charming part of the museum. You can give it really your DNA. And I had this fun now for, you said it, 12 years to do that. Time went by so quickly, it's amazing.
When did you first set foot in the museum?
I've heard about the museum before, of course. I knew when it was founded. I've always been in touch with watchmaking people, and they were always talking about this museum. I knew pretty much what it's going to be. I've never been before I was asked physically in the museum, but my wife was, and she told me about it and said, wow, that's a cool place. You need to go.
So literally, you showed up at the first day of work and walked into the museum for the very first time?
Kind of, yes. No, when they asked me to come and join, of course I did. I did go there, and nobody knew me, so I could just be a normal visitor and explore it myself and think about what could be done differently, where I could put my kind of fingers on where I think a museum needs to talk to the attendants. How can we make this dialogue with visitors and these watches? It's very sad that these watches are, there's 3,000 watches exhibited. They all sit in their showcases, 10 after 10, so a very smiley face they make to you, but they're not ticking, they're not talking to you, they're not showing you the time. So how can you make these pieces being more telling something about themselves? And that was the fun part all these years.
I'm just imagining you walking in on that important day and your heart beating as you're walking through, looking at all the showcases, meeting many of these watches for the first time, which you've seen in books, but maybe for the first time in person. And I'm just putting myself in your shoes and wondering like what you can do better to convey the messages from these watches to the world. And were there things, well, I'll put it this way, what was the first thing you wanted to change once you came to the museum?
I think visitors, when they come and see pieces, they want to know things about these watches. And there's not a lot of opportunities when you have so many pieces on display. You can make many labels, which we did. At least you know when the watch was made, which reference it is, from which year the movement is coming, and when the case was made, stuff like that. But you're very limited on the information you can put on a label. So we had to figure out ways to talk to the people. And we created, today it's very simple. You take an iPad, you program something, and then you tell the story about every watch, about every showcase. And that's how you can bring the pieces alive. You can show the watches from the inside out. You show the movement, you show the escapement, you show these wonderful engravings, and you show the case from the backside, or, all this made these watches more coming to talk to the attendants.
For any of us obsessed with all things Patek Philippe, we clearly believe that you have the dream job. And I just have a question. Is it, when you wake up in the morning, when you go to work, is it truly the dream job?
There has not been one day in these many years where I was unhappy, ringing the bell, asking security let me in the morning. And I come there every day at 7:30. So I go up to the floors, don't take the elevator, just walk up the stairs, look at the nicest pieces of the world, and there's nobody in the room. And I enjoy that for 10, 15 minutes before I go to my desk and start, answering emails or doing something else or writing the first text. So it's never been really a day where I regretted to go there.
What's it like walking through the museum with complete silence and no one else there? I've only been there when there's people around and there's always excitement and whispers and commentary, but you have the opportunity to be there alone. Is there almost do you commune with the watches?
Yeah, kind of. Over the years, I learned my friends better and better. Because you read about them, you take them apart, which I love to do. I study them really from the inside out. And so now when I see them, I know where their balance beats, how their heart beats. And I know the sound of these watches, and we always oversee that a little bit. We look at a watch, it shows us the time, but when you hold it to your ear, it makes fantastic noise. And I can recognize watches by their noise.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think this is important for our listeners to know. You started at a bench. You start as a watchmaker, clockmaker. Can you take us through how those early years in your horological journey began?
Yeah, my family, they owned some stores in Munich, and they decided when I was 3, this guy will become a watchmaker. So I had no choice, and I never questioned it. And I was always sitting at the desk of my dad and watching what he's doing. And when there was a vacation from school, I went to the store and talked to the watchmaker. So I really enjoyed that. I was always interested in history of timekeeping and of timekeepers, of course. And when there was an old watch coming to the store, I just took it and said, I'll repair it. And they were asking, are you able to do that? Maybe not. I will learn. And so I was always surrounded by historical timekeepers and timepieces.
Do you have a preference working with watches or with clocks in terms of as a watchmaker or a clockmaker?
Yeah, in the history, I was more a clockmaker. I worked on a very big exhibition called Clockwork Universe, which we showed in Europe and then here in Washington, D.C. That was in the 80s, a long time ago. And I knew everything about the Bergy clocks. Most of them I had on my desk, and I was able to open them and have a deep look inside. Several of those clocks I restored myself. So I was very privileged when I was young to touch those pieces. For the watches, that was always something a little bit further away. But now with Patek working at Patek Philippe Museum, it's just a joy to see these enamel-painted historical watches, 400 years old, look like they came out of the store yesterday, because this enamel never really changes its colors. Of course, when it breaks, it's bad, but normally it does not. And when you come to the Patek Philippe collection last week, we work on a catalog right now, we had 12 tourbillons disassembled in front of you. That's like, I don't know what you can compare it with. This is nothing you can compare it with. This is the dream of a watchmaker to have these kind of pieces in front of you. When I studied watchmaking, that was in the 70s, there were not a lot of people in the world who could build a tourbillon. And now I was buying a tourbillon from Breguet for the museum, and I have these fantastic Patek Philippe tourbillons in front of me. That's a dream became true.
So you have a table essentially with a dozen Patek Philippe observatory watches or tourbillons in front of you. And you're comparing and contrasting as you're studying these to better present them to the world. I mean, what is that like?
Well, first you open them and you look at the different kind of escapements. Some have an anchor escapement, others have a detent escapement, and then you make them ticking, you're listening to them. They really start to come alive. And then you look at the way how they're done, how is the surface done with the Côte de Genève, and all these little details. And we put them in databases and make texts out of that we really learn by looking at the pieces and by playing with the pieces and describing them better. Sometimes we have to go back to the archives and see which year was it made, who were the dial maker, who were the watchmaker, who did the ébauche for this piece. And every day we learn so much, and this is something you will keep with you all your life, and that's the fun part of the job. Everything I do, I put in this storage system of a database, but it's also in my brain, and I will keep it until I die.
And you referenced something earlier that truly resonates with me, and that's the importance of sound in inspecting and experiencing a timepiece. And you also said something earlier off camera about the detent and how much you absolutely love this escapement. Could you share those words again?
You know, when you hear an anchor escapement, it beats 5 times a second, big tuck, big tuck. And when you have a detent escapement, it makes tick, tick, tick. It makes you so relaxed. It's like doing yoga for your ears.
It's hypnotic.
It's hypnotic. It is, And the fun part in the museum is that we have a very well-trained team and watchmakers who can take these pieces apart. They can clean them. They can fix them. Photographers who find the right angle for their camera and for their lenses, and people who do the archival work. And it's so fantastic to work with such a team. They're so dedicated to those pieces that I enjoy that every day.
Before you take us on a virtual tour of the museum, I'd like to talk about the building itself. The Patek Philippe is housed in an early 20th century industrial building that was acquired by Patek Philippe in 1975 to house the casemaker owned by Patek Philippe, Atelier Réuni. Once the Plain-l'Ouate factory was built, everything moved out of what's now the museum building and went to Plaine-l'Ouate. And in 1999 to 2001, the Patek Philippe Museum, as we know it today, was internally built out and was renovated. Even an extra floor was added where your office is today. Can you tell us some more information about the building itself, its design, even its interior?
Let's start a little bit earlier. Patek Philippe had several locations in Geneva where they were producing watches and doing certain kind of jobs. So pieces had to travel between these buildings. And when they built Plaine-l'Ouate, the factory, then everything was housed under one roof. And now with the new building, which a few years opened, it provides enough space for housing all these specialists, and everything really happens in one building. That's fantastic for production. That's fantastic for team building. It also solves a lot of security issues because you don't have to move pieces around the city. And there were buildings like the museum building, which nobody needed anymore. And so the decision to make this to be the museum was a very wise decision. It's in downtown of Geneva, so it's very easy to access. In Geneva, you can walk from anywhere to anywhere. It's a very small town. It's fun when I walk into the door. They put a new wall on this historical building for the gate, and they have little plaquettes there, maybe 5 by 5 centimeters. And there's a little slot, and there's always pointing in a different direction. And I was always wondering what it is. So I had the chance to talk to the architect recently because I met him. And I said, what was the idea of that? Oh, this is the symbols of hands of a watch. And it was so easy, but it took really the architect to explain it to me. And now when I come there, I see there's little details which make the big picture.
I never noticed that. Where is that? At the front door?
No, it's not on the front door. It's where we, the
on the side.
Workers on the side go in the morning, where we have our security entrance. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole wall just of these plaquettes. And every slot points in a different direction.
I love that.
It's an hour hand. Yeah.
So thoughtful.
It's very thoughtful, yes.
Everything is with intention.
Very much,
museum.
Very much,
yes.
Yeah, very much. And the design, you were asking about the design, it was designed by Mr. Philippe Stern's wife. And she designed the showcases, she designed the layout of the collection. And it is like when she did it 22 years ago now.
The cases and the green carpet and the aesthetic with even the curtains. I mean, that is the Patek Philippe Museum as we know it.
And we keep it like this. So nothing has really changed. Of course, we had to redo the carpet and we had to build a couple new showcases because sometimes we buy pieces so that we need more space. But it all fits in the traditional design of the exhibition.
It's such a distinctive aesthetic that we all associate now with the museum visit. But you shared something with me the other day that I love. We'll call this wear patterns on the carpet. Now, picture in your house, if you have carpet, I picture the house I grew up in, the place where the kids would be running through the door, of course, there'd be more wear. And then there would be like the nice room in the house that the carpet was just perfect. So I have a question for you. Were there wear patterns on the carpet that indicate interest in certain cases?
There were, after many years, I think after 15 years of use, this carpet was really worn out. And it had to be replaced. The question was just how do we do this in order not to close the museum? So I've prepared that for several years. Philippe Stern once asked, what are the showcases people are really mostly interested in? Can we measure that somehow? And I said, that's very easy. You just look at the wear pattern in front of the showcase. So there were showcases where there was no carpet anymore. It went through almost a hole there. And these are the perpetual calendars with chronographs in combination. That's where people put their nose on the showcase. You have to clean it 5 times a day, but you could see it also on the floor. So I made a little documentation on the wear patterns, and we knew exactly which are the showcases mostly visited.
So complicated watches was at the top of the list.
That's on the top of the list.
Oh, that is so much fun.
Tourbillons, chronometers, even chronographs. The early chronographs, there were, you could really see the carpet is used heavily.
How about the ellipse case? Was anyone going there?
Well, I would say it was not really visible on the floor, but when I'm there, people go there.
That was very diplomatic.
Yeah.
In the future, the ellipse case is going to be really worn down. So.
Yeah, when I tell the people that this is blue gold, then they're very surprised. It's a patent by Patek Philippe. They mix cobalt with gold, and it's blue. It turns blue. It's blue gold.
People don't know that.
People do not know that. So I spend a lot of time in the collection. I talk to visitors. This is what I mostly enjoy, because this gives me the ideas of what we can change when we write our texts, what's known, what's not known. And people have never heard about blue gold.
Well, we're going to change that. So. Now, I'd like to call this segment the Patek Philippe Experience, where I challenge you to take us on a virtual tour from here in New York, but we're imagining we're in the Patek Philippe Museum. We walk through the opening gate. We go up those little stairs. We say hello to the receptionist, and then we find you, Dr. Fries, welcoming us. What's the first thing we do when we walk through the museum?
Yeah, when you're at this, let's say, entrance level, there are two watchmakers sitting in their studios with big glass walls, and you can see them repairing only the museum watches. That is always the question. Are these watchmakers working for the company or repairing clients' watches? No. They're only there to repair the watches of the museum. And I tell you, 3 watchmakers cannot fix all the watches in their lifetime. That explains you how big this place is. And then either we walk upstairs to the 3rd level, or we take the elevator and we explore the museum from the top, going downwards.
And what's the first message you want to share with visitors when they walk through the museum?
So I cannot assume that every visitor who comes wears a Patek Philippe watch. And of course I try to get them kind of involved in the discussion. And so my first statement is, which is the key message I want everybody to take home: it doesn't matter which brand of mechanical watch you have on your wrist. Every mechanical watch has at least 10 parts of Patek Philippe inside. And that's the crown winding setting mechanism, which was invented by John Reardon Philippe in Paris in 1842. And it revolutionized the watch industry, not only in Switzerland, worldwide, but starting in Switzerland, starting at Patek Philippe. So Mr. Patek, he heard about this. He was always interested in that subject. How can we get rid of the key? There were different attempts to do that. But he went to Paris, they had a conversation, and the rest is history. They renamed the company after the world first exhibition in London, in the World Fairs. And so it was called from then Patek Philippe, a company. And they have converted the whole line of watches from the key mechanism to the crown winding setting mechanism. So that means when you turn the crown, you wind the watch. When you pull the crown, you move the hands. And that was the big thing. It was not easy because the whole mechanism had to be changed. And it took Mr. Philippe about 30 years. He described it very well in a book in 1863, what the process was. He laid out how that would change the world. And by 1817, 1880, it was almost impossible for any producer to sell a watch with a key. So they really changed the world. And that's what makes Patek Philippe so important in the history of watchmaking. They are innovative, and they have never stopped to invent, and they came up with the greatest watches we see today in auction houses or in our boutiques worldwide.
And that's such a wonderful introduction to the museum. And I'm imagining people who may not have a Patek Philippe to look at their wrist when they're hearing this from you and smiling and feeling a little bit proud that they're part of this heritage.
Well, I think it's a good start if you don't have a Patek Philippe, but you have 10 parts of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think you get it for free.
I love it. So you're on the 3rd floor. And what's on the third floor of the museum?
On the third floor, we're talking about a little bit about the history of the company. We have a fantastic library, and we have a collection on portrait enamels of the first generation of enamel making. Enamel making, or enamel painting as it's called, is a technique which was important in Switzerland. It was invented in France, but then it moved to Switzerland for religious reasons. The inventors, the craftsmen, all moved to Switzerland, to Geneva, and Geneva became the hub of enamel painting over now 400 years. And we don't want to go too deep into that, but when in the 1960s, the class at the Academy for Enamel Painting had to be closed because there was not enough demand, there were not enough interested students anymore, it was Henri Stern and Philippe Stern who hired the best of these pupils. And Susan Rohr, she's alive. She's still alive in Geneva. She was one of the most prestigious and best enamel painters. And if you go to auction houses today, you know how they're valued. They are fantastic and they're beautiful, and they bring the paintings which are normally in museums in your pocket on a watch. And that's how enamel painting is so important for Patek Philippe on pocket watches, but also on the dome clocks. So that's a very important subject for Patek Philippe. And we show it all. We show it on the historical timepieces, we show it on these portrait enamels, and we show it later on Patek Philippe watches.
And you bring up an important point that some people are surprised that, yes, the Patek Philippe Museum obviously has the most extraordinary collection of Patek Philippe watches, but the antique collection is equally, and some would say even, I wouldn't say, it's equally as exciting to see one of the most impressive collections pre-1839 of, it's not only enamels, and we're going to go down the floors and take a look at that later. It's just all things horological. And I think the third floor really encapsulates that. It tells the Patek Philippe story, but it also talks, in this case, you're talking about the enamel exhibition. It educates about the whole horological tradition from Geneva and around the world.
Yeah, and you know, in the library we have a couple of discussion pieces, you can call it, like a fantastic clock from Bergy, Jost Bergy, a Swiss clockmaker who worked for Kepler in Prague, and the clock we have acquired recently is probably out of the hands of, it's made by Jost Bergy, but it's been with Kepler. And
that's the one on the far right-hand side.
On the far right side,
yes.
And Kepler said, Bergy is the Dürer of watchmaking. So what do you want more? So that's an important piece. It was the only piece which was still in private hands, and the museum acquired it now. So that's all on the third floor. But then you walk down to the second floor, the antique collection, and that's the history of watchmaking, the history of portable timekeeping.
What's the earliest watch?
The earliest watch, we have two very early watches. They are neck watches, so you hang them around your neck and you show basically you have a watch. It's very prestigious. And they are from the 1520s. They belong to a group of the 8 oldest watches in the world. And we have 2 of those. They are very nicely presented. And some of these early watches, they do have a movement made by ironsmiths, because the craftsmen of watchmaking did not exist at those days. That comes in 1550. So we are really before watchmakers did exist. And so they're completely made out of iron. And some of them do have sundials inside. And with the sundials, you can set the hour hand of the watch. These watches only needed hour hands because they were not very precise at those days. So a minute hand would have just be irritating everyone.
So some of the earliest watches, another wonderful visual, they were worn around the neck. They were a sign of wealth. Like, are we talking like the Nuremberg eggs, like that kind of style? Or what do they look like?
They look like drum boxes.
Okay.
And they have no glass. They have a lid with very small holes through which you can see the hand moving around the dial. So they're protected, but without the glass. And they do some ticking, but they are not very reliable in
how accurate?
keeping time. I would say you have to wind them about 2 times a day, like that. They're like the early iPhones. You had to charge them 5 times a day.
So they were signs of wealth, power.
There were signs
technology,
of wealth and power.
art.
And there are paintings showing people wearing them prominently and displaying them to their friends and say, I have a watch.
Some things never change.
It will never change.
We're in the antique collection on the second floor. What are 3 pieces that we must see?
There's one clock by Breguet. It's called a sympathique. It's about 2 feet tall. When the owner of the clock comes home at night, he takes his pocket watch out of the pocket and puts it in a little cradle. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, a little pin drives from the clock into the watch and starts to wind it. And a few minutes later, a second pin goes into the watch and adjusts the hands of the pocket watch according to the hands of the clock. So they synchronize. Parallel, it measures how much difference was there between the clock and the watch. And then a third pin goes in the watch and regulates it.
That's so amazing.
In the morning, you take the watch. You don't have to do anything. It's fully wound. It's fully set. And you just use it. One of the earliest examples of a non-key watch.
Now, I understand the museum has 2 examples of sympathiques.
Yes.
Which one is your favorite?
We have probably the most beautiful one, which was started by Breguet himself, and the movement of the watch is out of the hands of Breguet, but the clock itself was done a little bit later, so it was finished in the 1830s.
And is this the tortoiseshell one?
That's the tortoiseshell one. It's big, it's beautiful, and it's one of the most prominent pieces the museum has. It ranks in the top 5 pieces.
And I recall, because I helped sell that back in 1999, the first time museum sale, that was made originally for the Duke d'Orléans.
That's exactly.
Really, really cool.
Yeah. And there's not a lot in the world, I think there's 18 of these clocks in the world.
Incredible, incredible. So tell us about another piece on the second floor.
It's also fun that we have a very significant collection on Breguet pieces. Mm-hmm. We have 2 very early tourbillons. We have a Perpetuelle, which is considered to be the second most important watch Breguet ever built. So we are happy to have, I don't know exactly how many because it's quite a lot, but we have very prominent pieces out of the hands of Mr. Breguet, which I consider to be one of the most important watchmakers ever.
So you must have one of the most important assemblages of original Breguet watches in the world. Would you say the most important? Or am I pushing?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I think
one of the most important.
I would say this is not our core.
Yes,
we're Patek Philippe, and we will concentrate on the history of Patek Philippe. But I think a museum which has that approach to show the history of portable timekeeping needs to have a focus also on Breguet, because he made so many inventions, he tried out so many things. That's a must, and we are lucky to have them.
We have to talk just a little bit about English horology. Is there an English horological masterpiece that you'd like to mention from the floor?
There, not just one.
I know.
There's a perpetual calendar, the earliest perpetual calendar, 1863 by Thomas Much. For us, very important because Patek Philippe created the first wristwatch with a perpetual calendar. So there's a direct line. The interesting thing on this pocket watch, it does have a leap year indicator. The early wristwatches did not have that. Even the early pocket watches with perpetual calendars did not indicate the leap year. The engineers of the company, the watchmakers of the company, come and study that piece because it has, even for the annual calendar, a very interesting mechanism. That leads to the point that this collection is for visitors to show them the history of timekeeping, but it's also a resource of our engineers, our inventors, our watchmakers to learn from history and build watches for the future.
So at this point in the tour, many people are overwhelmed as they're just entranced by this antique collection, which frankly, Patek Philippe might have brought them through the door. That's what they came to the museum for. But they're propelled into the past before the era of Patek Philippe, learning about these early watches. And I've heard from many visitors, they'll get stuck, lost in this world on the second floor, and then they'll have to come back another day to absorb the Patek Philippe floor, because that, for the Patek Philippe universe, is very overwhelming. So we go down the stairs to the first floor, and you're just surrounded by a Patek Philippe Disneyland, for lack of a better word. What's the first watch that you'd want to show people when they're in this amazing place?
Yeah, you said it very nicely and interesting. Many people never make it to the first floor. They get really stuck on the second floor. With the historical timepieces, people who have never been there, there's 150 showcases with 1,200 timepieces. And that can absorb you. It can take all your time if you're not careful. And people are surprised. They do not expect that. When they go to the Patek Philippe Museum, they think it's a company museum. I will only show pieces of the company. No, it starts with this historical approach, giving the background to what Patek Philippe stands for his history, respect from history, learning from history. And when you go to the first floor, it's overwhelming again.
You have to push a reset button.
You have to push the reset button. You come in a completely different environment. In the antique collection, there's only one watch, which is made by Patek Philippe, which is at the end, which guides you to Patek Philippe. And it's one of the very first ones with the crown winding setting mechanism. So that's the key story. We say now it's over with the key. All the watches in the antique collection are wound by keys. Now we're coming to a new era, 1839, founded in Geneva by two gentlemen which were in the Russian wars and coming from Poland and Czechoslovakia, and they kind of tried out something, building watches in Geneva for their friends, of course. All these early pieces have images of Polish history, and these were the immigrants who came to
and this
Geneva.
Is Patek and Czapek.
That's Patek and Czapek.
Yes. Can you tell us a little about Czapek? Not many people know about him.
Well, both of them, they were founding this company. Mm-hmm. And when Patek himself, Monsieur Patek, when he came to Geneva, he started to learn painting with Calam.
Alexandre Calam.
Alexandre Calam.
It's my sister's favorite artist, by the way.
He's one of the great artists in Switzerland. Yes. And his paintings are huge. Mm-hmm. And they show this dramatic waterfalls and forests. And
beautiful landscapes.
It's the Swiss landscape, in a very dramatic way. So Monsieur Patek was very interested in that. And he had an artistic kind of a sense. And it's not from nowhere that later, Monsieur Patek and Monsieur Philippe always said, we want to build the most beautiful watches. And on top of that, they want to build the most precisest watches. But again, it started with these two men who worked together for a few years. We do not know why they separated. That's not identifiable at this point of time. It worked out for the first couple of years, so we're successful. Monsieur Czapek created beautiful watches. He then went to Paris when they separated, and he worked for the emperor in France. We have a few of those pieces, and then we lose track of him. We think he went back home. He wanted to build a watchmaking school there, but we've never heard of him again. And so the history of Patek Philippe really starts with the invention of this watches with a crown. They early used industrial exhibitions as their platform. The World Fairs, the first one in 1851 in London, opened by the Queen. And Monsieur Philippe stepped up to the Queen and said, here's a watch with a crown. And that was a big success. She also wanted a traditional one with a key, so she had two. And she bought one for her husband, so she went home with 3 watches of Patek Philippe. 2 of those are now displayed at the museum.
Where's the third one?
We know where it is, and I'll send flowers every year. So I hope one day it will end up in the museum. I'm pretty sure it will.
So Prince Albert's watch.
It was Prince Albert's watch.
Unknown at this point where it is.
Yeah. No, it's known. I know it.
You know where it is.
I know it.
Does anyone else?
I hope not.
I'm on the job. No, it would be amazing if that piece.
No,
was
it
in
would
the
be nice
museum
to
bring them back.
To bring them back. Yes, yes.
I'll give that as option. Not the first thing to see is Queen Victoria's pieces. I mean, those are crowd favorites. What's the next piece that you'd have to show on that floor to a visitor? And I know there's hundreds, but you have to.
No, I think the story is really about the beauty of the watches, and it's about the preciseness. You just have to imagine, how do you measure in a competitive environment? And watches in the 19th century were as important as today mobile phones. There's huge competition, there's a huge market, there's huge investments, and there is lots of innovation. How do you measure that you built the best watches in the world? That is one part of the story. The other part is that observatories for observing stars, they needed better watches. They complained about the bad quality the market delivers. So they created a competition that started in the 1860s, and every watch producer was delivering watches anonymously to these observatories. And there were not a lot of observatories doing that. A very famous one was the observatory in Geneva. And they tested these watches. And they've done this kind of until the quartz watch came into the game, so for almost 100 years. And within these 100 years, Patek Philippe made more than 50% of the first prizes, gold medals, and whatever these awards were called. And the rest had to be shared with all the other brands. I think that's a big message.
It's impressive. And we see on some certificates of origin, the words above competition are seen.
Yes. Can
you share with us, what does it mean to be above competition in terms of the observatory trials?
Well, it's all about preciseness, because that's what it was all about. And so they had to be adjusted against cold, against heat. They had a special category on isochronism, so of the amplitude of the balance. They had to be measured in different positions, dial up, dial down, vertical, dial crown left or right. And they were heavily measured over weeks until the report was written. And it's interesting that we know from our archives that the price for regulating these watches by the so-called master régleurs, these are the superstars in watchmaking, is about 50% of the sales price.
Wow.
That's like tuning a Formula One car.
Yes.
They don't add any pieces, they just turn some screws to make it faster and better. And that's the same with these watches. They turn a few screws to make the balance working better and working in all positions precisely, being resistant against change of temperature. And some of these watches have been tested by several generations of master régleurs and being made better and better. Some of these watches have never left the company. They've been there forever. These are prototypes. They have never been in private hands. That's another nice thing of this museum. There are pieces never been in the market. And we have one of these watches, which I always call the most precise watch in the world. It's been in this exercise several times with different master régleurs between 1930 and 1960. It never had a case, so in 1960 it got a case, and now it's in the showcase. And I call it the most precise watch in the world. If you look at it, you wouldn't believe it. It's very modest.
You just said something that just blows my mind, because I've never connected the observatory trials to what we see on most Patek Philippe watches, on the movements. You'll see engraved starting in the 1930s, maybe even a bit earlier, all the way for decades. The movements will say, adjusted to heat, cold, isochronism, and 5 positions. This was a humble brag that I think directly correlates back to the observatory trials, which those were the requirements for the trials.
Exactly. That's where it comes from. It says with adjustments.
Yes.
8 adjustments. And it's all about the observatory trials.
I love it. It just ties it all together. You have one more watch you could show us on the Patek Philippe floor. I know this is the ultimate challenge. What is the piece that because we have to run out the door, what's the piece we need to see first?
It's always difficult to answer that question because all the other ones will be so unhappy.
I know.
And they will be stopped ticking. I'm definitely in love with pocket watches. Also in the auction world, they will have a great renaissance and they will have a great future. And so I love to take my tourbillons apart. But when I find a wristwatch with a tourbillon, we have very early calibers with tourbillons inside. Not many of these were built. We have 2 of them in the museum. They are fantastic. Or where I think Patek comes closest as a company, Patek Philippe as a company closest to their goal to build the best watches in the world, when you look at the secular watches, secular calendars.
Such as the secular perpetual calendar made for Seth Atwood.
And we have 2 of them in the museum. For people who are not so aware of what that meant, but leap year was invented by Julius Caesar, so 2,000 years ago, because he figured out that the calendar and the constellation of the stars is not synchronized anymore. With that leap year, with this additional day every 4 years, he kept it kind of synchrone, but in the 1560s, so 1,600 years later, it was again out of sync and completely out of sync. So what they did in 1563, they cut 10 days of October. So October 16th followed October 4th. In one night, synchronicity was there. But then what you do for the future, that it doesn't happen again. So the 400-year rule, which they established, the Pope, says that every century you can not divide equally by 400 will not be a leap year, even if you can divide it by 4, which is the rule we all know. So the year 2000 you can equally divide by 400, so it was not a leap year. 2100 will not be a leap year. 2200 will not be a leap year. This watch can do it. And when in front of visitors, I say, it's built for the next generations, because all of us here in the room, we will not be able to see that.
So there's one gear that rotates every 100 years.
It's not just one gear, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's a very special complication. Or take the caliber 89, which calculates the Easter date. We have the prototype in the museum. There's no other watch in the world who can do that.
And these watches are computers.
These watches
literally.
are analog computers. That's what they are. You know, they're caliber 89 with 33 complications, 1,800 parts, I think. It's amazing.
No, it's important to note that there is a moving target that anything that goes in the museum has to be over 20 years old. Is that true?
Yes. Yes, it's true. The Stern family wanted the museum not to be a point of sales. They really wanted to build a museum. They wanted to be part of the museum family in Geneva. And they don't want to give visitors the impression what you see in the showcase you can buy. These are historical pieces. Of course, many of these pieces you find in the auction world today, and they are on the market. If you have enough money, you can buy such pieces as well. But the rule is that the last 20 years of production are not exhibited at the museum. But there's a big safe, and the pieces of the last 20 years are always waiting there to be added to the museum collection. And now it's December, so in a few weeks I will go to Plan-les-Ouates and go to the big safe and take another year of beautiful watches. And
that must be fun.
Very fun pieces, and they are brand new. They've never been opened. They're still in their boxes. I have a vault with hundreds of pieces. They're in their boxes, never been opened. and we will take them out and we'll put them in the museum collection. Every year is the same procedure. It's a lot of fun.
What is the most modern, in terms of production date, watch that you have in the museum today? What's the most recent watch?
The most recent watch, yeah. It is a Grandmaster's Chime, and that's an exception from the rule because it's from 2014, so normally it would not be displayed, but we think this watch is so important, chiming the date and having all kind of features of double face dial and hundreds of parts inside. It's one of the most beautiful watches we have. So we said we break the rule just for this one, and it's already on display.
That's fantastic. Now, this is my final set of questions for part one. I'd like to talk about the Stern family a bit, and it's no secret, without Henry Stern, without Philippe Stern, or without Thierry Stern, there would not be a Patek Philippe Museum. You, over the years, worked very closely with Philippe Stern. I'd love to hear your just some stories of what was it like to work with him to build what is basically his personal collection. What was it like to work and continue to work with the Stern family?
I think I'm a very lucky guy, being in a transition time from Philippe Stern to Thierry Stern, and now even the next generation is already waiting in front of the door to come in and work. I see that transition. I had for many years meetings with Mr. Philippe Stern, with Mr. Thierry Stern, and I could see how they interact and how we could transform that into the museum in certain ways. They are different, and we need to build this museum, for everybody and for both of them. So that was a very interesting time. Now Mr. Philippe Stern is a little bit more, he's still responsible for the museum, and he approves every acquisition and he makes proposals. So the work has not stopped working with him, but he's not anymore in the company. So that makes also a difference. And now it's Mr. Thierry Stern who runs the place, and it's amazing how successful this company is. I think we're all very proud to work there. And to work with them, having them in direct contact was a privilege, and I know about that. And making acquisitions for the museum, and in these 12 years, we made a lot of acquisitions, quality-wise. Now our rule is if we buy a piece, it should be in the top 3. So. Of course,
top 3 in terms of importance?
Of importance, of quality. So if another piece will be added to the collection, it has to really make a difference, because we have so many pieces. That leads that we don't acquire so many anymore, but when we buy really the high quality. And with Philippe Stern, Mr. Philippe Stern, it was a joy, because I went to auctions. He was with me in my ear, on my phone, and so we were there.
The museum is very much alive, growing, vibrant. It is the center of the horological community, not only for Patek Philippe, but my final question is, what is the future of the Patek Philippe Museum? And for Peter's answer, you're going to have to wait until part 2. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you could join us for the next episode to hear the answer to that very important question and more in our conversation with Peter Fries. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so that you do not miss any future episodes. This is John Reardon for Collectability.